Get bigger. How the frick window settings? Oh yeah, here we go. Larger. Oh yeah. Hold on. Oh yeah. Alright, can I move this more? Oh my god, I freaking can. Oh, we're frick. Oh, now we're frickin' talking. Alright, I'm gonna type in chat just to make sure that she works. Hold on, hold on. Where's the mouse? Where's the mouse? Where's the mouse? Mouse. Where the frick is my mouse at, dude? I can't see. Oh, it's over here. I found it. I found it. Oh yeah, we're in business. Alright. We can actually play now. After 9 years of freaking setup. Alright, are we good? Everything fine in here? Oh, I gotta move my webcam. Oh, where frick that shit. Alright. Okay, I need to put these wrists on because I'm probably gonna start throwing sheet. Alright. Chat's working. I can see my sheet. Now we can actually play the game. How long have I been streaming for? Didn't take that long. Why the frick is my desktop right there? What the frick? Oh, I figured out how to jump. Why are you over here for? Get the frick out of here. What are you doing over there? Window list. Display 2. Get the frick out of here. What is that? God, I don't want a freaking desktop. I put it there. Well, frickin' put that sheet away, dude. I'm just kidding. Alright. Alright, so fair warning. I don't think you guys can see my chat because I have my game capture on. Can you guys see chat right here? I don't think you guys can. But if you guys see me do this, then I'm looking at chat. Then if I go like phew, you know. Alright, body. Here we go. I'm like 5'7". Again. Why am I so far away, dude? Like, give me that 6-foot boy. Hell yeah. Shirt size. Large, I guess. Belt. Sure, yeah. Body, legs, yeah, sure. Advanced. I'm not doing that. Okay, cool. Controls. Smooth, yes, cool, yeah, whatever. Okay, cool, like that, okay. Hey, what's up, Eli? What's up, man? Alright, quality preset, medium. Let's just say that's fine. Audio, I'll change that when you guys tell me. Spectator. Warning, these settings come in for serious comment. Okay, sure, frick that. I already have my sheet. Okay, what? This is my... Aw. Okay, no, I'm good. Alright. Okay. Oh. Wait. Okay. Gotta reset. Oh. 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 What? I kind of want you over here. Can you? Why are you over? Why are you not? Why are you behind me? I don't want you behind me, my guy. Oh. I want you over here. Okay. I guess you guys see my back. Sorry. I don't want to be over here, my guy. My green screen's right here. Okay, I'm literally gonna hit my green screen. Can I change some sheet here? This is not okay. What if I center this way and it goes the other way? Sir, do you not understand the process of recentering? This is not recentering. This is doing jack sheet. What? Hello? What's happening here? Okay. This is not helping me at all. They expect you to do all this? Alright, well, I guess we're going over here, my guy. Austin, try recentering and using a button press on your controller. Oh, there's a button. Well, I had to open up the menu for it. Oh, I forgot you don't have an index. I opened up my Steam VR and center it. Is there a button combination for that? You should look that up for me. Okay, well, I literally can't go over there because that's where my green screen's at. So, yeah, I'm gonna hit my green screen. So what if I go behind it? Hold on, I got this. Watch this. Watch this. Watch. Wait for it. Wait for it. Wait for it. Oh, yeah, not working. Not working. Okay. I don't know why it's not working. I've never had a problem where restarting doesn't work. Oh. Yeah, Valve Index. Yeah, yeah. Actually, now I'm thinking about it. Oh, that's the. Oh, okay. I figured out how to. Oh, I forgot how to do that. Ha. All right. What does this button do? I feel like a noob, dude. I've played this shit freaking for ages. Get the frick up. Oh, I forgot I can move. Ha! I'm freaking. Oh, I gotta grab that. How do you do that? Get, give me that sheet. I would. Oh, okay. No, no, no. Go away. How the frick do I grab this beach? Is this not what's it called? Oh. It, sir, can get in my hands? Hello? Help! I gotta be back here. Get in my freaking hands. You ready? Yeah. Sir? Frick? I already don't know how to play. What? I pressed that. Oh. Oh, it's me. No, it's me. Wait. Oh, shit. What number to have? Oh, whatever. Oh, okay. Don't do that. Okay. Don't do that. Oh, oh you want to see VR? Yeah, I am. Wait. Oh, you can't use. Oh, I can't. I can't use that sheet. Am I supposed to put this around me, dude? Oh, dude, I can't grab stuff. Off cam. Oh. Sorry, I don't have a big enough green screen. Low key, you gotta deal with them, sorry. Am I really supposed to... Am I really hanging myself right now? This is how you start... This is how you start the game? This is a lot of shit. Oh, shit. Oh, whoa, whoa, whoa. Pause. I gotta turn the volume down. I can't. Holy shit, that's freaking lot of shit. Wait, wait, wait. Whoa, 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 whoa.
Well, folks, this stainless steel signature edition blade will cut through anything, but it's not gonna stick.
Get the fuck out of here, later, Peach. I gotta turn my volume down. I gotta. What's my volume button? Oh my god, what the frick is. I just had the freaking menu open. What the frick is it? Hit the Rift menu button on the right controller and then recenter view should be on the first screen. Oh no, that's what I used. I thought you meant it's like a button combination instead of having to go through the menu. Yeah, that's what this sound is right here. I don't know if you can hear that. Maybe it'll work now. Yeah, it's just not working at all in this game. I thought you meant like an actual like button combination to do it through the buttons. What the frick is the menu button, my guy? Game is garbage. Can't say anything yet. Oh, it's right here. Duh. Frick. We're gonna turn this to like 4. Can you guys still hear that? Or... Now I can't hear a sheet. Are they making combo hotkey but can't find anything yet other than the menu way? Oh. Oh, okay. Oh. You're telling me one thing is gonna change it so I literally can't hear anything? Or you're telling me that makes it so I can't even hear it? What? Oh, frying pan. Oh yeah, get that shit in my holster. Get him on. Give me that shit. Oh, what's this? Yeah, I ain't gonna give a frick about that. I gotta change one more thing. Alright. I go real quick. Not really any much better, but we'll just say it is. Hopefully this is still working. Oh, you know what? I can just do this now. I can just point this way. And, oh my god, freaking dumb. Am I facing the right way now? Okay, I am. Let me get. Oh, shit. Oh, wrong button. All right, I forgot. I gotta press that. Okay. What? Okay. Goddamn feet. Okay, let's go. Motherfucking frying pan, dude. How do you get this sheet in my freaking sheet? Oh, I have to open up the menu, you freaking Dumbo. What is on there? There we go. Oh. 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 Oh, okay. I'll keep this on me. Oh, what? Is this? I hate how I can't do that. Frick, dude. Oh, dude, Chase, you're in the game. Dude. Oh, jeez. Freaking Christ. Chase. A team is Indiana Jones speech? Hell yeah, dude. A great liberation with the underworld as we have decided to seal the tombs and track any record of these. For time we have energy. Head towards. Alright. Oh, I can freaking stab him on shotgun? Oh, hell yeah. Okay, that was a lot more anticlimactic than I thought it was going to be. Dude, it actually sticks to it. That's freaking cool. Now the audio is low as frick. I think it's just because it was cinematic. Here's my sheet. I wrote that sheet. This is going to break. Huh. You know. Oh. Okay. Look at that. I ain't falling. What the frick? Hell no. Give me up in this. Oh, shit. That's falling too. God. Oh. Oh, wait. I need my act. Check. Oh, oh, shit. Whoops. Wait, hold on. Okay, yeah, Max is gone, dude. I lost Max. Oops. Sorry, I got a torch. Everything's fine. It seems that Heaven's Reach or Elder has been Heaven's Reach. Fallen fantasies. Creepy. Oh, that is my motherfucking green screen. Alright. Play again and just that. Alright. Oh, key. Oh, dude, it's freaking. Okay. Can't you just. Oh, I can. Not. Okay. Okay, so this is just a... Why am I holding this? This is literally just like the same sheet as frickin' Boneworks, but it's just more... What's it called? Ah! These are the frickin' collectibles, right? Get out of my hand. Got a white landing webcam. Yeah, that's my freaking stupid ass filter, dude. That sheet's all fooked up. Yeah, I'll try and fix it real quick. Is it on the right side? Hopefully it is. Okay, let's just hope that fixed it. Now the left screen, now the left side's probably gonna be fooked up. Okay. Where'd that sheet go? Oh. You know what, dude? We're freaking rolling with this. Freaking the big ass freaking basket right now, dude. Hell freaking yeah. Give me this motherfucking sheet right here. Where'd it go? Oh, Jack, I can barely see it. Can you just... Fine, I'll do it the dumb way, alright? Get this... Wait, I want it... Oh, you know what? Oh! It didn't change? Oh. Got any sheet down here? No. Alright, sick. Love that. Alright, watch this. Easy money. Open up, beach. Get out of my goddamn way. Oh, sheet. Oh my god. Get. Hey. Frick. Get. I got you, homie. Don't worry. Never mind. Oh my god, selling that shit in the table shop. Ooh. Okay, it has the sensors for the index, for the fingers, but you can't hold sheet like that. Watch. See, I can't hold it. I have to press this freaking trigger. Freaking stupid. Is there an option for that? I should probably look that sheet up. What is it, locomotion? Alright, what the frick are we picking here? We going with the frickin' big mace or the small club with the spikes? What do you think? Why doesn't that just stay on there? What were you thinking, Chase? What were you thinking? A little weird that we put these torture weapons on display. I understand we're trying to maintain the dungeon. Why doesn't she just stay on the frickin' screen, my guy? Somehow is read that. Alright, I think we're gonna chill with frickin' I'm kind of feeling this one, not gonna lie, dude. I think we should just frickin' dual hand this beat. Or see, that's more. Oh, okay, I like that. All right, can I hear me out here? We're gonna go. Okay. Okay, we're gonna change that. We're gonna change that to. Okay, then we're gonna go here. Get. Okay, dude. Look, give me that sheet. Get. Oh, sheet. What is that? Give. I'm trying to pick up the frickin'. Okay. Jesus frickin'. Yeah. Can I put that in there? Can I hold that sheet? Okay. Ooh. Get the goddamn way, my guy. You can have fun with that. I'm taking this sheet. I would like for you to go in there, please. I would like for you to... Okay, you know what? You're going the old-fashioned way, dude. You're getting in my... Uh. I need to turn the sound up, dude. But every time I turn it up, it gets too freaking loud. I'm gonna put it back to 6. See how drastically it changed? Now all of a sudden we can hear 20 times freaking better, but what do you know? It freaking changed one sheet. Got our first enemy. I don't know why I'm holding this because I can't even freaking anything with it, dude. I'm freaking pissed. This is not what I had right there. Do I even have anything on there actually? I didn't even save the freaking thing. It's right freaking there. Alright, you know what? We're getting that sheet. Get me the frick out of here. Open up beach. Green screen. Alright. You know what? Frick that big one. We're going with the small one. I don't give a frick. We're gonna smash this beach's head open. Yeah! Freaking beach. Alright. Sir, why do you never... Why don't you want to go in there? You should not be causing me this issue. Bruh. Bruh. Do you want to go right here? You know what? You're just being held, dude. You want to cause as many freaking issues, dude? You're just... I'm holding your sheet. Fuck that stupid ass sheet. I can't even hold that. Put that in the freaking thing. What's up, homie? I get smacked in the face with a motherfucking club? Fuck you alive still, my guy. Yeah. Oh. Do I have to... Oh, shit. Okay, get on the floor. Ah. Alright, alright. Ah. Okay. Do I want to break this right now? Wait, let me check. Maybe I need those. What is this? Oh, you know what? Maybe I need the frickin'... Maybe I need to use one of these motherfucking sheets to get this thing open. You know what? We're gonna save that. Dude, I really wish that you'd frickin' work, because it's really nice being able to frickin' do that. I don't know why. It's because I have something there. I knew that. Wow, dude, I'm frickin'... Get the frick out of here. Get in my hand. Go right there, dude. You're going right there. I forgot I had that. Let's not talk about it. Alright. Alright, I want to get that. Can we get that real quick? Can I vault sheet like the other game? Oh, I can totally get across this sheet. Oh, we're totally climbing. You can climb in this game, right? It's just like Boneworks, I can climb on this sheet. Do I have the trigger to do that too? I do. Not that much. I can use my frick. But never mind, I'm not getting that. Frick that. I don't want that anymore. You know what? Frickin' we're breaking this, dude. You know what? Frick, I don't want this barrel. I might need this one actually. We're gonna keep this one. Okay. We're gonna keep this one. Alright, here we go. Watch this. Okay. Put that sheet. Give me that sheet. Put. Ah! Okay, that works. That works. Dude, this is not even that big of a frickin' barrel. There's no chance they can't just... Get him. Stay the... Don't move. Alright. Ah! I probably could have done that without it. I don't think we needed that. I really want to know what's up there. Let me freaking hear me out here. Hear me out here. No, that was close. That was close. That was close. That was close. I think we just Alright, guess we're sticking to a motherfucking knife. Alright then. Lost my club. It's, you know what? Give me that freaking torch back. That sheet in my... Oh! Oops. Alright, we lost that, but... We lost that, but it's fine. I mean, I'm already freaking dead. Can I just go over this? Watch this. Watch this. Watch this. Ready? 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 Oh! Okay. Oh my god. Okay, you get someone when you almost die? I like that a lot. Am I gonna die because I need to kill somebody? I am dying. I am dead. Okay. I forgot that's the thing in this game. Okay. Is there a freaking run? Yes, there. Yeah! There's no shot I'm gonna die again. Am I seriously gonna die here right now? Okay, I was about to say. No freaking shot. Where'd the frick did my knife go? Got it. Freaking kidding me? It's not rocket science, just freaking jump. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Dude, what song is this? This is my freaking jam right here. Dude, freaking lava gang, let's go. Oh, you can't move that. Oh, you cannot move that. Okay, well, you already know we're going up there. Copyright. Whoa, I guess, spoke to the game, Chase. Thanks a freaking lot, my guy. I was enjoying that. Like that sheet? You never seen better freaking. Oh. Yeah, I jump high as sheet right now. Oh. Got this. You know what? Watch this. Ready, ready, ready. Bar flip. Freaking god, dude. You're. Oh my god. You ain't never seen no. Get him! Oh. Okay. Nope. Okay. Get. Stay there. Don't motherfucking move, beach. Alright, how the frick do I get up this shit again? Just freaking. Get. Oh, I probably need to jump. Okay, you don't need to jump. Okay. Get me. I would like to get up here. Let me just hoist my sheet up here. Oh, there we go. What is this? I did all that for this? Can you hold this like a right? Thank you. They're throwing out the extra French and land data and go we'll start smuggling out. But in French and land we can use this space to test something creative. We're still together rooms and eventually house and army create for summation. First roll logging, talk about logging. You missed? I don't know what you're talking about. Is there any way I can Oh. I could have, I could have just done that, and I could have, maybe dropped it over here, but, you know, we don't like doing that, right? Oh! Oh, I need to do that. Open up, beach! Oh, Pokeball. Okay, nothing up there. I don't give a frick about that. embrace of the divine will. These are things you can vault, right? I'm pretty sure you can vault anything. Yeah! Wait, I want to go over here first. What am I doing? Always check these freaking trash bins. I don't know why, but sometimes they have good sheet in them. This is not something I can do. Alrighty then. Yeah! Maybe I need to hold that shield. Any secrets? 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 No. Yeah. Okay, that was not as cool as I wanted to be. I like how it says I'm destructible. Yeah. Beach. You freaking give me anything? How many know about this? Where's everyone? What the frick is that? Oh boy. Oh no. Oh shit. Oh shit. Oh shit. Right. Oh shit. Get the What the What the fuck? Let's get the shit out of here. Get the What the Where did my crowbar go? Wasn't I hitting him with it? Oh my god, let's get the shit out of me. Give me my give me, thank you. I forgot I had to go in the middle. Alright. That scared the shit out of me. Alright. Do I still... Okay. Alright. Okay, everything's fine. Where am I at right now? I am nowhere in the frame. Hey, how's it going? Alright. Thank you, sir. I am not fit to be a VR streamer, dude. Please don't jump scare me. Please don't jump scare me. Oh, you know what? These are collectibles to show you what you've gotten, huh? I like dude crosshair. What does that do? What was that? What is that little icon? That was the best thing I've done. Oh, not these mud truckers again. Off center? Oh. Oh. Don't move. Gun here. You lying to me? Oh, shit. Oh my god, dude. Oh my god, we're playing CSGO right now? Please, game, just freaking work with me, my guy. Don't make me freaking bend down just to get a motherfucking freaking shit, dude. Oh, got it. Beach. Freaking get the frick out of my game. How do you eject? It's the wrong button. Oh, shit, what the frick? What the frick? Oh, ammo. Oh, that actually worked. Alright. Is this the... Used to it. We're getting used to it. It's been a while, dude. It's freaking been a hot minute. I cannot open that. When you aim, the in-game points us at the wall. When you aim... What? Oh, you know what? It's because I'm using my left eye. I have my screen capture as right eye, so I'm looking at my. Oh, I guess this is still right. Yeah, my sheet. Okay, what am I doing right now? Am I okay. This right here, me aiming. What does that look like for you? Aiming quickly open snap. Oh, fuck. Come on, let me get ready real quick. Can you guys hear my fans? Hopefully not. This is not easy. Oh my god, I freaking did it. There we go. I am. Oh god, help. Hold on, I got. What's happening? Okay, we're good. Hold on. Alright. Okay, I'm gonna do it. Okay, here we go. Let me get on this first. Anything up here at Hellstone? No, okay, we're good. Alright, we're gonna aim right here. Alright, here, let's get the full aesthetic going on here. Alright. Oh no! Enemy! Boom! Get it? Oh yeah. I don't know if this is your chat. I'm gonna assume it's so because your name is long. And I have to bring my phone to my sheet. Oh, what the frick? It aims you guys at a wall. What the frick? Okay, well. Okay, maybe I'll. Okay, let me try this. Let me try this. Let me try this. Tell me if this is better. What if I aim farther away like this? Instead of going close like this, what if I go like that? If not, I might have to change my my game thing to be left eye, because I believe with left eye, you should be able to see it. Easy money, run it. Okay, I'll try. Okay. Ain't nobody give a frick about that. Alright. Money. Note to self, you can't open that. You already know I'm getting this. Do I have to go? Am I gonna go back down there and get this? Freaking hell yeah, I am, my guy. Yeah. Oh, I don't need that one. Yeah, that's metal. I knew that. What the frick is the point of this thing? Oh, I could have shot those and killed. I'm a freaking dumb, dude. I use stuff. Oh, look, it's a freaking little thing, dude. Oh, oh my god, dude. Alright, Chase, here's your lesson here. No, you already know this sheet. That's dirty as fuck. You should probably clean that. That is dirty as sheet. Yeah, you should probably clean that. Alright. I'm open both doors because I'm a freaking badass. Which one am I facing right now? I can feel the tension on my headset right now. Alright. Yeah! Oh. It's your boy. Ooh, ooh, ooh. Ooh, ooh. Ooh. Oh. Oh. Can you guys hear okay? But he's gonna get beat. Get the. I'm peacing out for a little. I'll try to join on PC. Fucking bet.
The next transit arrival is expected at...
Oh, bye. Oh wait, they can only aim for the head? Are you dead, sir? I'm gonna assume you are. Did they both die? You dumb beat. When are you gonna have anything in you? How many times am I gonna destroy a sheet to figure out you have freaking jack? Give me something, an item or something? What the? What button is that? Shit. Boy, figured out 100% over now. Hey, Eli, Raft's pretty fun, man. They added a lot of sheets since the last time I played. Freaking sick. Dude, why do you cause me so many issues? Why can't you just be nice? I am not on the floor right now. I am totally gonna use this to capture somebody. Who the frick wants to get captured? Ooh. Right, just gotta make sure. Ooh. Ooh. That is not what I wanted to grab. Oh, shit! You. Yeah! Oh, get. Oh, shit! I gotta kill him! Beach. Wait. Yeah! Beach. Did I kill him? I didn't kill him. Oh, hey, how's it going? Yeah! Beach! Get the frick out of my sheet. That didn't work out that well. We got that sheet. Easy money. Beach. Give me. Okay, are these things I should be looking for? Is there a shovel coming up here? I'm pretty sure that's what these mean. Can I just use this? Watch this. Can I just... Yes, I motherfucking can. Doesn't really work out as much as I really want it. Alright. Oh, okay. God, I wish I was more freaking responsive, dude. Jesus Christ. Okay. Got that. Anything in here? Oh, okay. We should probably be responsible. We should put those. This is gonna have ammo in it. I have a crowbar. Do I need it right now? Do I have it? Nah. I like how it slides. If I ever leave tension, does it slide? Okay. Okay. Oh. Frick is going. You guys about to freaking clopped right now, dude. I'm about to just head camp here. Beach! Get the frick off me. Are you dead, sir? Uh-oh. Okay, we're good. Ooh, what the... What the fuck is that, dude? Oh, is this a freaking two-hand, dude? Oh, dude. Inoperable geometry? I think it's definitely supposed to be a freaking two-hand, dude. That's fine, not gonna lie. Can I break this? Where did this come from? Yeah. Okay. Maybe I can't destroy the seat. Okay. I can't destroy that. Wow, this thing is really not good for one hand. Yeah. Freaking beat. Okay. Should probably just like glance at these to see what it's talking about. And if such as engine fans, they must be secured to lift and beach. I swear it's freaking pointless to get those. Oh, I'm about to headshot the freaking shit out of this beach. I need someone to put you. Can I? Alright, we're gonna try a new tactic of aiming to see if you guys can actually see it. I think my bolts are good, man. So. I'm gonna take a wild guess you're probably freaking dead. So we're just gonna go with that. You are 100% dead. Don't please, sir. What the frick is that? What? Do I got a flashlight on me? Ooh, man. Do I want that? No, I don't give a frick about that. That's too freaking dark. I ain't getting the sheet till I get a motherfucking flashlight, beach.
This sector is experiencing
Oh my
a
God,
temporary lockdown.
Is there any getting beat in one of these freaking days? Staff only, beach. I'm staff. Open the frick up.
People think we need an army.
That beach gonna wake up. I'm gonna frickin' shoot that motherfucker right now, dude. I ain't giving no sheets. What do you frickin' know? I frickin' told you. Beach! 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 Wait. Yeah! Oh! Get the frick off! Yeah! Wait! Yeah! Yep! Ah! Okay, a little hard to see. Beach. 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 How am I? I'm not even aiming up there? Oh, there we go. I think my aim sucks a little bit. I think I killed him though. Is this gonna be the same song, dude? What the fuck is that? I would like to grab that if you don't mind. I would love to. I would love. Okay. I would love. I don't want that anymore. I'm over it. Who the frick holds a hammer like that? Shut the frick. Shut the frick up. Shut the frick up. Do I want this instead of the crowbar? Yes, I do. Fantasy lift 16, prepare supplies, load lift, check, wait for me to, and lift, recover, lift new. Presence. Okay, wood fire. Ah. Similar to spelling app? Similar to wheel? What the frick? At there is credit 20% variance in total entry. New laws and regulations. You worship us? Huh. Introduce violence. Oh look, Jason's here. It's cool because literally someone put this shit on paint and just put that shit in the game. Dude, I'm reaching behind my back, my guy. Frick your computer, dinosaur have an ass, beach. Frick your stupid ass frickin' monitor, frickin' garbage, frick your circuit boards, frick your computer, frick you. I didn't put that in my thing. Here's what we're gonna do. Frickin'. This is we're gonna do tabletop simulator in this beach. Get the frick out of my way. Okay, you have some shit on you that looks kind of shiny, and I kind of want to know what the frick it is. What are these things right here? Can I have these? Looks like they have like. Looks like it has some like frickin'. Oh, on that beach. What the frick is this thing? What is the frickin' thing? Anything up here? Anything I'm missing here? I'm trying to get everything right now. I am missing sheet. Oh, we're in this beach. Alright. I don't know where the frick you have me go, my guy, but you're not where I want you to go. Oh, yeah, uh-huh. Drop down. I'm not holding on to that anymore. Like, please don't jump scare me. Is this going backwards? I'm gonna... Oh! Get the f... Alright. Gun or knife? Probably freaking gun. Oh. Oh, this is pretty freaking dark. Oh, look, no enemies. Get him. Yeah! Oh. I don't appreciate it. That's freaking cameras. Give me my MU. Thank you. Frick you. Oh, I forgot I can run. Oh, my lordy, lord, holy shit, not freaking up. Oh, we got these motherfuckers back. Wait, you're teamed up with frickin' them? Did I even break those, dude? I don't. Oh, we're freaking going sneaky. Get the. Get over. Oh, we're going. Oh, we're. Do I get the sniper? Get. Sir, don't look at me real quick. I'm gonna grab this whole. Okay, I didn't really want to do all that, but I mean, I guess that freaking works. I would like to grab this, please. Oh, hello, sir. You are gonna get me caught. Can you freaking not? Oh, shit. Oh. Yeah. Oh, shit. I should probably reload this. Yeah, I'm not really interested. Oh! Yeah, does this thing have ammo in it? Yeah, oh! I guess we're checking now. This does not have ammo in it. Frick you, beach. Oh, shit! Get the frick. Get the frick. Get the frick off me. Okay. Frick this, I'm standing up on this beach. Frick crashing down. I would love for you to give me some motherfucking ammo right now, my guy. This, do you mind, yes, hello, ammunition. Do you mind if I grab you real quick? You just don't want to get in my sheet? I realize you have to get the, I'll use my motherfucking gun on your freaking sheet, motherfucker. Get the frick off me. Where the frick did you come from? You're still alive? Bitch, no, you ain't. Yeah, bitch. Yeah, bitch. Frickin' motherfucker. Disappear right now. That's my frickin' thought, bitch. Where the frick did you come? Wait, is there a frickin' respawn here thing that I'm missing? Where's my frickin' ammunition at? Okay, there has to be a frickin' respawn thing here. I need to get my sheet up. Yeah. Yeah. Oh shit. Let's reset a little bit here. I need to reload my sheet, but these motherfuckers keep spawning in. Hey, frick that sledgehammer. I don't want that sheet. This homie's behind me still has a gun? But I can't do a sheet that quickly. Where's my freaking... Dude, how do I get my ammunition? I'm doing that way, my guy. I don't know what the frick crack you're freaking smoking right now, but I'm freaking doing this. My freaking ammunition back. Put that sheet. Get the... Let me do my sheet. Get the... off. Freaking... Get the fuck off me, much. Get. Is it? Oh. Oh. Okay, never mind. Wait. I'm not dying, Pete. You're dying before me, much. Get. This is not how I want this to go right now. Oh. Oh, I don't know if you guys are aware. The ammunition goes right there. I didn't know if you guys knew that or not. Yeah, ammunition goes right there. Now we're freaking talking my motherfucking language. I don't know if you guys knew that, but the ammunition goes there. Forgot my goddamn way. Alright, we need to be freaking quick here because these punks respawn. That looks appetizing. Or appetizing. Oh, this is one of those little hovercraft thingamabobs. Wow, you guys take a lot of shots. I have to like grab exactly where it's at. I'm dumb. Did that even go in there? No. Go in there though. Better run that sheet. I don't need no freaking gun, dude. Frick guns, man. I got a motherfucking hammer. Alright, I think I need to kill this guy over here real quick. I don't think these gun guys freaking respawn. Pretty sure he's right freaking behind this sheet, so maybe I should this is a freaking beach. Do not want to do that. He moved. he moved. He's not over here anymore. I don't know where the frick he went. Okay, I realized I have to grip as well as trigger pick up stuff. Which low-key is freaking stupid. I don't know, that's kind of like a mechanic. It's me. Christ. Oh, alright. That works. Alright. That works. I don't remember, oh my. I don't think that's reaching over to him. Pretty sure I'm wasting ammo. Wow, this is... Okay. Dude. What the frick is up with this ammunition dealio problem we got going here? Oh, I forgot I had to grab and hold. Frick, I keep forgetting. God. Frickin'. What have I been wasting ammo on you right now? God, this is frickin' scuffed. It's gonna take me a while to get used to, VR games again, but Jesus. Oh, where the frick my bullets are going. Not where I'm aiming, I'll tell you that much. Not where my sheet's going. Uh, uh, don't mind. I'd appreciate to not be saying that. I'm pretty sure there's stuff underneath that, but anybody got time for that? Oh, that was quick. Can you close that behind me? Thanks. Are you gonna kill me? Is this the execution room? I know. Oh, so. Ah. Where the frick do I want to go? Guess just frickin' two, right? Oh yeah, I forgot I have this. Yeah. Frick you. Ooh, frickin' watermelon up in this beach. Ooh, what the frick is... I don't think I can do that. Alright, we should probably just frickin' dip. I don't think I put that in my thing. I did not put that in my thing. Still kinda... real frickin' wonky, dude. You got that time. Dude, I am frickin' sweating. And my sheet is dripping off my sheet. Whoa, 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 look, man, look.
Welcome home. Everything's possible.
Look. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Whoa, 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 whoa. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Whoa, 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 whoa. Whoa, whoa, whoa. What's the freaking watermelon? I wanted that sheet. Oh, sheet. Okay. I guess I'm not having watermelon. Dude, this freaking headset, man. Holy bonkers, this is hot. Holy freaking crap-a-doodle. I need to make this so I can't interact with it. Oh. Enabled it, but I don't... do I want a crowbar? No. Freaking strong as sheet. I'm in this motherfucker. Alright. Got the big boy out. Probably, Alright. Ooh, okay. Is this like the main menu now? It sure does look like it. Okay, this is the... Okay, this is definitely the main menu or whatever. This is like... I think there's like, what, 6 different game modes? Oh, mods, experimental, sandbox, and parkour. Parkour. Okay, so is there no frickin' campaign to this sheet? Oh, okay. Welcome to the Bonelabs. This is our virtual work site for developing and creating physics. We see passionate page. Oh. 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 Passionate secure and unavailable. The options. Alrighty. That is a key. The that. Oh. I should probably do that. Oh. 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 Okay. Okay. What else we got? What else we got? Oh, it shows you up there. All the freaking same. Oh, is it changing the? Okay, it's changing all this. Only 2 freaking pages. Leave blank. Oh, dude, that looks sick. Well, I want to be a motherfucking polyblank, dude. No, freaking polyblank. No. Yeah, dude, we're freaking balling out here. Alright, what the frick do we want to do? Should we just go down the list and start with 1? So is this sheet just, what is this? Factorial? This is what, tactical skirmish courses to home fun. Precision is king. Okay. do I have to? Oh, this is something you click on. Okay. Let's do drop hit. Oh, oh my. Okay. Highlight the game. It's pretty cool, dude. The intro is pretty sick. I guess it's just gonna be. I don't like how it's over there. I guess this is just a game that has a bunch of game modes you can try. I don't know if there's an actual campaign to it. So this is the drop pit. Assuming they got some freaking cool ass guns in here, dude. Are these all? Are these both the same, just different colors? Yes, they are. Let's freaking try this one out. I gotta get better at this ammunition, man. What the frick is this? Bullet banker? What the frick all these different colors mean? Is that like different, Oh, I have a limited amount of... Okay, I have a limited supply. So I should probably not grab, Oh, yeah, you like that? Watch this. Oh. Did I reload it? I did. Alright. I guess we'll chill with this. Let's start off with easy. Let's just get the feel. I'm gonna die. Let's freaking do this sheet. Oh, we're just going right in this beach, huh? Where the frick do I hold this? Right here. Alright, we're going right up in this sheet. Alright, am I timed? I just start freaking killing people? Okay, so I just gotta sit here and kill people, that's it? Oh, this is time. This is freaking holding a piece of ammunition up right now. Apparently that's ammunition I'm freaking using right now. I'm still getting used to these weapons, man. I haven't played VR in a hot minute. Probably tell them freaking garbage ass freaking aim. God damn, I have bad aim. I am time limited. Where's my sheet at? Frick this, man. Sorry, I ain't got time for this sheet. Hopefully I passed that. I did. Okay, I keep going until I fail. Okay. That is not hitting him. Good God, this is freaking... Oh my God. Oh, Jesus. I'm not very good at the parkour in this game. This... You freaking punk, man. You freaking motherfucker. Can I still vault stuff? Oh, I don't need the vault stuff. Frick that. I'm out of freaking ammunition. Frick out of my sheet. Can't make that. Watch this, dude. Freaking pro move over here. I freaking missed. Get the frick. Hoist your motherfucking sheet up here. You are wasting so much of my motherfucking time. Get your ass up here, dude. Get the freaking punk. Punk. Am I missing people? I didn't kill someone, didn't I? Where's that little thing at? Can I go through this? Yeah! Okay, I cannot go through this. Okay, I think I missed someone. I'm pretty sure this is supposed to freaking open. I just wasted all my time getting through that, and I freaking missed somebody. Where's the thing at? Oh no, I freaking finished it. Where am I supposed to go? Oh my god, I'm supposed to go in here. Okay, we have 3 minutes. We're kind of chilling right now. Frick. Oh, what the frick? Okay, wait. Whoa, 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 whoa. Okay, frick, give me some of these. I don't know how much I have. Let's do frickin' sensor. Hey, apparently he already had shit on it. Okay. Hopefully you guys can see this, okay? Get the Get the frick out of here. There's 14? Definitely missing people. Damn, bro, I got some decently good aim right now, dude. There's still 2 more? I didn't freaking see 2 more. Oh, 1 more. Pick on one at. Oh. Okay, it's like my ammunition is a little offset. This is the wrong freaking clip. Get the sheet. Yep. Go, 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 go. Get the frick out of my way, beach. Okay, no pistols past this point? Alright. Alright, new weapon. What we getting? What we getting? Yo, this is kind of sick. Alright, what we getting? Let's check it. Let's get 2 of them. I don't know what the frick that is. Oh, oh boy. Alright. Let's do, this one. I'm already... Okay. I don't know if this is reloaded. Definitely reloaded. I would like a strong explanation of where the frick my bullets were going right there. What the frick, my guy? Oh my god, I have to put this in with my one. Where does it even go? I don't know how to use frickin' guns. I don't know where the frick you put this sheet. I don't know how to use guns. Where does the ammunition go? Oh, it goes in the bottom. I knew that. Oh, it goes in the bottom. Yeah, it goes in the frickin' bottom. I don't know if you guys did that or not. Yeah, I frickin' didn't. Wow, this is tough, but also really freaking cool. Oh, frick. What the hell? Oh, I have freaking 7 minutes, dude. We're kind of chilling right now. Dude, where the frick is my gun going, dude? I'm already freaking out. 3, 4, 5, 6. Hopefully that killed you. What the frick? Okay. I missed. Got him. Got him. 2 more. Right frickin' here. Bop. Sheet. Oh, sheet. Get. Oh, you freaking kidding me right now? Jesus freaking holy frick. Oh my god, dude. What the frick is that? Is that me? 8 minutes. Someone did this in 1:15? freaking have god tier aim for that? God, dude. That was freaking cool. I kind of like that. That was sick. Oh, it's actually in the front of me this time. Because I'm facing the wrong way. You guys have been seeing my back this whole time. I need to face this way. Alrighty. Alright, so, I mean, that was pretty freaking sick, not gonna lie. Alright, shoot again. Okay, let's go to medium. Let's get, frickin' 2. Okay, let's go 3. And let's start off with the motherfucking egghead. I gotta realize where each one of these points are. Because I don't know much about freaking guns. Oh, medium, they actually go towards you and they have a lot, and they shoot you. Oh, this is nothing to mess with. Oh, this is serious business now we're talking here. Okay, we got, this is serious. Talking real but big boys now. You're gonna do that shit when you're freaking dead, my guy? Freaking reload. What the fuck? Are you freaking kidding me right now? What the frick? What the hell? Who the hell is freaking alive? Oh frick, god. Frick is happening? What am I doing? What the frick? And these guys have a lot of freaking health. Where the frick is the last one at? Is he in the corner over here? Where is the last one at? God, this movement is what is happening, dude? Where the frick is the last one at? Did he glitch somewhere? What the frick? Well, now I'm about to fail because wait, is it done? No, because this open. Open up, beach. Dude, I don't know where the last one's at. He didn't freaking spawn in. Beach. This beach ain't here. Unless he went down here, somehow dropped. Motherfucking check. Down here. Freaking went down here. I don't know how he got down there, but he freaking got down there. Freaking down. Frick, man. Get the frick in there. Oh boy. I keep trying to frickin' pick up the thing and it's not really working out. Not really working out too well for me here. I'm a little frickin' rusty at this because everything is getting me caught unless I have my frickin' hands up. Dude, this thing has a frickin' stupid amount of frickin' recoil, dude. Holy frick. Dude, how many freaking shots do you need? Crap. My man has like 17,000 health. Come on, beach. Got for me, huh? I ain't got cheat because I ain't got no ammo, huh? I don't know how I've managed to do these things, dude. I'm freaking grabbing the clips. I'm motherfucking dropping the clips. I'm replacing clips. I don't know how the fuck I'm doing these things. Gunplay in this game is definitely not meant for me. I think I'm wrapping myself in a twist here. Unless I'm just in a... I'm in a really awkward angle. That's what's happening here. I need to be like right here. What the frick? Dude, I'm not crouched. Frick. Ah, frick. Where the frick did my gun go? What happened to my motherfucking gun? The frick did you get back there? Did I do that? What the frick is happening, my guy? Oh shit. Dude, what is up with my gun? Oh my frick. Thank God you freaking killed yourself. God, this is the most scuffed gameplay I've ever motherfucking seen. What in the frickin' world, my guy? Did I do it? How do you get stuck on that? Do you want... What am I stuck on? Get off the thing, what? Move out of my way, bitch! I'm not grabbing that, my guy. Ah, beach. What the frick are you holding on to? What are you... Can I just go through this? No? Dude, I am probably gonna fail because of the sheep. Get your ass up on this sheep. Right the frick now, beach. No, it's not my tracking, dude. I know I have a good tracking. I didn't even freaking pass it, dude. There's still one alive. I did all that for no freaking reason. Okay, luckily I found this beach. But note to self, dude, this freaking AK is a bunch of hot motherfucking garbage. Thing has a stupid amount of recoil. It's freaking, oh my god. Alright, get this garbage weapon off of me, dude. Get rid of this. Where the frick is the thing at? Frick that weapon. Thank you. Do we go with the silencer again? These guys take a lot. Alright, maybe we should go with the silencer. Let's do with the, this one has a freaking laser sight. That sounds good to me. How do you guys survive a freaking pistol shot to the freaking brain, dude? What the frick? I don't even need to aim, dude. I got a motherfucking laser sight, beat. Except when I have to reload, then things get a little wonky. Oh, I can probably go up there. I think that'd be smart if I went to up there, but am I gonna go up there? Hey, yo, motherfucking nah, dude. I gotta pay attention to the sounds, because you guys are making sounds when you freaking die. Not really paying attention to the freaking sounds. Oh god, you gotta give me one of these guys now? Okay, that's clearly not working very well for me here. Got the freaking sweet spot. Beach! Beach! I got a laser sight, motherfucker. Don't need to aim my sheet in. Get the frick out of my motherfucking sheep. Oh, shit, that hit me. Beach. Did I kill you? Nope. There's 14. There's how many left? I know you're not freaking dead, my guy. Get up here. Oh. Oh. That, oh. I thought I had more missing, but I guess not. Alright, shotgun time. We'll use... Oh, dude, I gotta get up close and personal. Let's go with frickin' this one. This one looks frickin' sick, dude. Is this thing already frickin'? Yeah, it is, my guy. It's gonna be frickin' fun, man. You gotta get all close and personal, dude. Definitely have to focus the frickin' blue guys first because these motherfuckers slap some shit at me. I don't frickin' like that. I'm gonna frickin' die. I don't have any frickin' ammunition. Oh god. Oh, I killed him. Oh, I killed him. Oh, oh shit, I frickin' killed him. Oh shit. Oh shit. Oh, that was frickin' badass, dude. I don't know how the frick I did that. I don't know if you're cocked or not. That was frickin' badass, dude. Can you survive that? There's a blue guy behind me. I can freaking hear him. What? I did not dodge that very well. Beach. One more. Where'd now look? Where'd now look? Where'd now look? Where's this dude? What behind here? Did I look behind here? Oh, he's over there. My gun going. Up Monchaka. Yeah! That was freaking terrible, dude. I pressed the button. I didn't get a chance to see what my time was. That was freaking stupid. Can I see my time right here? 7,010 minutes? Not too bad. We're gonna try hard. Fuck that, dude. Let's go back to the main menu. I don't know what this button does. That reload the whole thing. Don't really know why I pressed that. I think it reloads the whole. Dude, I am freaking sweating, man. I need a freaking built-in AC unit up in this mother trucker. This sheet is freaking wild. Also, I can tell where you need to go depending on the fan. Okay, that definitely refreshes it. Go to the freaking tab. Alright, let's check out the next freaking game. Ooh. Alright, that was what was that? Tactile? Oh wait, there's two different game modes. I forgot. Let's do the trial. I called this trail. This is not a trail, dude. This is the freaking. Do this. Alright, so we did the drop. Let's do the freaking trial, which means probably gonna be time based. Probably the same thing, but obviously a little more different. Alright. It's the same sheet as it. Ooh. Whoa. Oh, we get dualies up on this mother trucker, dude. Oh, freaking man. I just smacked that with my brain and got all the ammunition out of that. Whoops. Well, what is yellow? Is that's probably medium, right? Light, medium, heavy. This probably uses medium, so let's go with this because we used all of our freaking ammunition on this. Where the frick does this clip go? Alright, I figured it out. And I figured out where the thing's at too. Alright, let's do easy first. This is kind of cool. Alright. Ah, alright. Game. Alright, there's 30 guys here. This is just a time based where I need to run around, kill motherfuckers, and probably get a freaking time. Hopefully you guys are dying because motherfucker, I ain't fucking. You know, going into the motherfucking slide. That would be fantastic. I wish the HUD would show up like, oh, I guess it's not. There's more than one spot here. Can I go through this? We're going through. What's up? Fuck you guys got rolling up in this beat. What kind of operation you guys got going on over freaking here, dude? You guys are dying, but if we got the run back, dude, we got a motherfucking run back. Oh, dude, this would be so good with the freaking shotgun. I'm gonna have to try a shotgun next. Alright, now here comes the fun part. Frickin' forgot someone. Never mind, we do not. Get the fuck out of my game. Let's go. Did I get it? Are you gonna restart? Did I win? Alright, am I supposed to do something else here? Did I frickin' win? $145. Okay, I mean, that ain't okay. Frick that gun. How do I restart? Do I have to press this button? I mean, this is the freaking refresh button. Alright, let's do a shotgun next. Actually, let's do shotgun easy, because shotgun is freaking satisfying. I think, I don't know what ammunition shotgun. Probably red, huh? Red for freaking shells. Dude. And I see. That is definitely shells, right? Run this. Oh, dude. Bam! I don't have any ammunition. Guys, give me 1 second. Let me just get some ammunition real quick. God, freaking grab, dude. Frick out of my game. Frick out of my game. Frick out of my game. Oh, I forgot the freaking. Fucking not dead with that? Fucking freaking hacker up in this. Yeah. Give me 1 second. Let me just bam, I missed. Bam, right in your face. Bam, right in the eyeballs. Bam. Bam, frick. No shot, you just freaking survive that shit, beach. I've already used 6? Frick that ammunition, I don't want that shit. And the nukes. I killed you with that too? Frick, sick. I've only killed 16? Frick, what the frick? Get frick. What's up, bitch? Yeah! Yeah, I don't have any ammunition. Second here. Yeah! Are you dead? Are you freaking kidding me? Didn't I just fill you up with ammunition? Fuck, I suck. God, dude, guns and freaking VR, dude, do you think would be sick? I mean, don't get me wrong, they freaking are, but frick are they like confusing, man. Like, what's not? It's not confusing. What the frick? I'm trying. Okay. What you gonna do with that? Boom, right in the legs, motherfucker. Hee hee. Fucking I'm already out. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh god. Yeah, fuck. Freaking my game. Yeah. Ready? Yeah, fuck, I missed. Fuck, sheet. Oh god. Yeah. Bam, beach. Yeah, we're going a little backtracking here. Now, what's up, beach? Oh shit. Fuck out of my game. Fuck out of my game. Fuck out of my game. Fuck out of my. Oh shit. Fuck out of my game. Oh fuck. Oh god. Ah, fuck out of my game. That was freaking terrible. 3 minutes. Okay, you know what? Fuck medium. We ain't doing that shit. This one's cool though. You just, all you have to do is just freaking learn the route, and you're freaking good. To be honest, nothing really that challenging about that. But that was cool. Freaking cool, man. My chat is not completely my motherfucking chat here. Get back down here. What in the world are you doing? Freaking messed my chat up, dude. I tried scrolling through it and now I fucked it up. I think we're good with the tech trail. Let's do number 2, which is gonna be the motherfucking arena, which sounds freaking sick. Container yard, fantasy arena, tunnel tipper. Fully functional arenas for Fantasyland. Fight for hours or attempt some challenges. Let's do the container yard. Woo! Alright. What this motherfucker has for me here. Container house map. Void pump, boom, boom. Defend the void pumps while charging the void battery. Harness the void energy to defeat strong foes. Survive void. Do I have to press? Oh, okay. Oh, survive endless waves of enemies. Use the void barrier to harness energy to open the void. Let's do survive. Go a lap before things round 1. Oh my god. Do I get some shit here other than frickin' this? What the frick is that? What the hell is this thing, dude? Oh shit. What the frick kind of garbage ass gun is fucking that? The motherfucking weapon, bitch. Oh, you guys are realistic as shit. Oh my god, what the frick is that? What is... You guys are realistic as shit. Okay, I'm not surviving shit up in this beach. Get the frick off of my sheet. This is... What does this do? Oh. Oh. Slap. Dude, that is freaking loud, my guy. Okay, you guys, to be fair, you guys gave me a freaking garbage ass motherfucking weapon. What the frick is this, my guy? I can't even shoot much with this. This is not the gun for me. There's someone behind me shooting me right now. Oh my. Oh, that's the sound of them freaking respawning. That's what that sound is. Okay. That man freaking flying out here. See that shit? Yeah, freaking, I'm not just camp here, dude. Whoa. Still alive? No, I'm on beach. Oh, shit. Probably not stand next to a freaking respawn point. What? Wow. Oh my. Okay, this is not. Oh my lord, this is not the place to be. I need to get back to my freaking sheep. My freaking ears are freaking beach. Oh my lord. Alright, definitely need to stay over here. That is not the correct positioning here. What the frick did you come from? I forgot you spawned there. So really, there's no way I'm really getting away from you guys because you're all just over here chilling. And I'm just trying to freaking do shit. And you're freaking shoot shit at me. And I'm trying to freaking get done here. Yeah. Bam. Wow. I'm gonna check this freaking gliding down. This is a freaking warfare right here, dude. Pretty sure someone spawned behind me. Is there a spawn right there? Dude, my freaking eardrums, my guy. Can you freaking not do that, please? Dude, my freaking ears. Hold and grab him and do this and do that. Freaking just work for me much. I go, holy frick. I don't know if I have unlimited ammo, but holy crap. What the frick are these things, dude? Freaking healing pad or some shit? I freaking suck. I'm not gonna talk about that. Frick, I suck. Oh, now we're talking. Freaking clean ass headshot. My ass is dead. Oh my god, you're not freaking dead. Holy frick, he's a god. Ooh, that was clean. Oh god. What the frick? Oh god. Oh Jesus. I freaking suck. I don't know if you guys have heard that, but it freaking sucks up here. Dude, why are you so freaking loud? It's really just not freaking necessary, my guy. Freaking straight up, dude, not motherfucking necessary. Yeah, I like being close to you guys, but you're also absolutely freaking terrifying. And you're bleeding my eardrums out of my freaking mind right now. And my aim freaking sucks. This is not a very good combination we got going here. Freaking cock weapon back because I had to freaking move. I'm freaking trying to shoot these guys, and then bad things are happening. And then I freaking suck. And then I'm getting stuck in the corner. And then I'm gonna hit you in the freaking face with a gun because I don't know how to freaking cock my weapon back. Oh my god, dude. I don't have any freaking ammo left. Ah, okay, just walk into that. That's cool. Holy frick. Okay, I'm freaking setting some motherfucking records over here. Oh, what the frick? Oh, good freaking job, my guy. Congratulations. Please yourself. Oh, god damn it. Fuck, I need to kill someone, I need to kill someone, I need to kill someone. I need to kill somebody. I need to kill somebody. No. Fuck. We almost got him. We almost got him. Dude, I feel like I did pretty freaking good, not gonna lie. That was actually pretty fun. Even though I got slapped, I feel like. That was freaking cool. That is a nice freaking middle spot to chill. What the frick is this thing, dude? What's happening? Oh. What the frick? This is a freaking barricade maker? Are you freaking kidding me right now, dude? I had this sheet. I didn't freaking know that. What the frick? What this thing was, dude? The freaking frick? Can I put you somewhere? Hell yeah, I can. Alright, frick it, let's do that again, dude. That was freaking cool. Now that I have this thing, I can just freaking barricade sheet. Okay, I definitely don't want to be here. Can I, do I have anything on me aside from this? I can do survival. Do I have... I need to get rid of these. Can you make these go away? Alright. No. How does one use you make things go? I didn't. What if I just frickin' slap your... I had to actually break your shit down. Okay. We are going to press excuse me, sir. Goddamn done that. Get rid of this sheet real quick. Pronto motherfucking cookie. Get rid of this. I don't have any motherfucking ammo in this. Get rid of this right the fuck now. I need to motherfucking leave, dude. Reload the frickin' weapon. Alright. Okay, we need someone to frickin' chill. Oh my god. Don't lock him out. Oh my frickin' goodness. Okay, is there a spot that has something frickin' loud? I kind of forgot the layout, not gonna lie. Oh, this is a nice little frickin' spot right here. Oh, dude, this is frickin' nice. So I got endless food, right? You know, let's just frickin' barricade the frickin' pieces of shit. I mean, my ears hurt, but you know what? That's fine. They're getting through. I should have had like a peak spot here. Okay, you confirm you cannot go on that. Alright. I don't think I really thought this through that hard because now I'm freaking screwed. But watch this. Freaking, I'm a god out here. I can make myself a motherfucking track to go on real quick. That is not how that works. Okay. Let's try that again. I don't want that. Yeah, it's coming through out here. Animal Beach. Oh yeah, I am too heavy. Alright. The confirmed cannot do that. I just lost my freaking weapon. Everything's fine. Okay, we can totally... Oh, fuck, I cannot get to this. So I'll just freaking outbreak it. It's fine. It's fine. It's not fine. Dude, I need to freaking get through the here, my guy. What the frick? Frick is homies freaking dive. Oh, you guys can. Oh, you just freaking ragdoll? Yeah. What the frick? You didn't guess I freaking do that. What the frick? Frick you beach. Frick you beach. Frick you beach. Frick you beach. God damn my freaking ears, my guy. God, I freaking missed. Okay, you know what? Frick camping, dude. We ain't no freaking punk, dude. We're freaking out here. This is for the void pump that I'm not freaking doing, dude. So we don't want to give a flying crap about that right now. What I do care about is my freaking headset twist up and I can feel the tension in the motherfucking face. That's what I kind of care about. Sit your ass down. Sit your ass down, bitch. Sit your ass down. Oh, shit. Yeah, a little cocky, a little cocky, a little cocky. Wow. Wow, wasted a whole clip. What happened to my gun? Game bugging out, not my fault. Like, I'm down to just sit here and freaking waste shit like no freaking tomorrow, dude. Fucking, we have limited ammo, dude. I can sit here all motherfucking day and do this, my guy. Think you're freaking hitting me? Hell no, you ain't hitting me, motherfucker. Oh shit, I freaking shot that motherfucker. Okay, you know what? You hit me, but it's fine because I wanted to get hit right there. Get the frick off of my Jeep. There's no way I'm about to lose this guy right now. I just lost to that guy. I don't know how that even happened. Couldn't figure out if I needed ammo or if I needed to be cocked down or out, forward, backwards, but either way, we got food. This is pretty cool. Let's go check out what else we got here. I forgot what the third one is. The third one parkour? That's gonna be fun. The gunplay in this is pretty cool. Pretty cool. I think this is the same thing as Boneworks though. Like mechanic wise, I think it's just I don't believe Boneworks had that's just sandbox. I really care about that. I kinda wanna chill. Okay, this is definitely parkour right here. I kinda wanna see the new sheet and then we can do freaking mod something. Alright. Parkour, special obstacles, hunt, faster times. Let's do first one, Dungeon Warrior. Oh, alrighty. Like we're doing pretty good here. Things on 79%. Chilling, we chilling, we chilling. Alrighty, what we got here? 3 minutes. Oh, who the frick is Benny? My name is freaking God, dude. That's a freaking legend. What a freaking legend. Alright, frick reading everything. Let's just freaking go. Oh, this is a full-blown obstacle course. Oh my goodness. This is a full-blown obstacle course. Freaking am I right now? Oh my. Frickin' go. Oh! We're not gonna talk about that. Ooh, yeah! Oh! Oh! Oh, shit. Okay, we need some space here. Let's... Dude. Okay, so it bases off where you're looking and also pressing forward, and it's kind of freaking freaking me up a little bit. God, dude. God, oh! That is not ducking. Definitely need to go a little bit harder than that. This is not going to be a very good time here. Ow. Okay. Look at that sheet. Ooh. Can I just... I don't need to... Okay. Ow. Okay, one hit. I mean, it makes sense. Freaking big ass axe. Okay. Ow. Okay, already did. Alright. Frick it. Run for it. Oh, okay. I was thinking if I can, you know, just dodge the thingamabob. Confirmed you cannot dodge the thingamabob. Definitely have to dodge this, even though I still ducked. But I guess you have to actually duck IRL as well. I mean, I could have figured that, but that was not very good timing there. Okay, we're not really doing too good here. I will get it. I promise. Watch this. Boom. Duck. Jump. Fuck the definition of jump is, because definitely not jumping. That is an axe to my face. What is happening, dude? Oh, here we go. You freaking dog. What I'm doing? Beach. Suck. Or where I was going. Okay, here we go. Wait for it. Wait for it. Go. Stop here. Go. Crouch. And the go. Back up. Go again. Crouch. Don't know why. Jump. Crouch. Keep crouching. Jumping. Jumping. Not jumping long enough. Go. Crouch. Crouch. Jump. Jump. Death. Alright, go again. Stop. Go. Stop. Go. Crouch. Crouch. Jump. Hit. I didn't really want a long jump there, but I mean, I guess that freaking works. I mean, if you don't mind, I'd like to see what else this course has to freaking offer, you know what I'm saying? That's freaking cool with you, you know what I mean? Maybe I need to just get on the ground, down the floor here. I think that's what I need to do. I think the game is telling me, get the frick on the floor. Even if I touch the top, oh, I kind of forgot. Even if I touch the top, that kills me. Oh, I forgot there's one right there. Go. Stop. Go. Crouch. Jump. Back. What's the deal here? I don't know how the frick I survived that, dude. Not gonna lie with you. Are you freaking kidding me? I'm 4 minutes in and I haven't even got pats. You know what? I think this requires a nice good old motherfucking restart. That's what I think this needs. I think we need a freaking... Okay, it's gonna spawn me over here. Maybe we don't need a restart then. I freaking lied. We need a freaking restart. How the frick do I restart? Levels? Go back to the freaking... Frick that level. I'm gonna be back for a couple seconds. I'm gonna go get some freaking water.